From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Hello and welcome. My name is Rob Casper. I'm the head of the Poetry and Literature Center here at the Library of Congress, and I'm very excited to welcome you to our second Literary Birthdays event of the spring, celebrating poet and 12th consultant in poetry at the Library of Congress, Robert Frost. Before we begin today's event, I'd like you to turn off your cell phones and any electronic devices you may have. Yeah.
What's the first, by the way?
The first event was, I believe, Edna St. Vincent Millay last month, and we have, I think, 2 or 3 more coming up. If you want to know about our literary birthdays, you can check out our calendar. We have a calendar of upcoming events out in the foyer, and also you can check our website. Yes, we're currently in our second year of the literary birthdays. They've been a lot of fun, and it's a thrill to be able to celebrate one of our consultants. I also want to tell you a little bit about the Poetry and Literature Center. We are home to the Poet Laureate Consultant in Poetry, which is what the consultant became by an act of Congress in the mid-'80s. In addition to this event, we put on literary readings, events of all sorts throughout the year, some 30 to 40 readings. In fact, we have one tomorrow. If you are a proud Southerner, we have the Fellowship of Southern Writers. We're celebrating at 6:30 tomorrow with our Poet Laureate Consultant in Poetry, our current Poet Laureate, Natasha Trethway, who is a native Mississippian. As I said, you can go to our website if you want to find out more about our events, which is www.loc.gov/poetry. And we have some materials out in the foyer. You can also sign up for our GovDelivery RSS feed so we can tell you all about not only the literary events the center puts on, but all the literary events here at the Library of Congress. We also have a special treat in the foyer, the previous Library of Congress magazine, which has an article on Robert Frost's inaugural poem, Dedication, a really wonderful article called First Draft, which is worth checking out. You can read a little bit about Robert Frost and about our featured poets in your program, which I believe are on your seats. As you can imagine, we couldn't be more excited to have Dana Gioia and Eric Pankey here to help celebrate Robert Frost's 139th birthday. For this series, we usually invite one local writer and one out-of-town writer, and we are happy to have Eric, who has been a force in the DC poetry community as a professor in the creative writing program at George Mason University, in the former spot. The latter is no stranger to Washington, D.C., though. For many years, Dana served as the chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts, supporting artistic excellence, creativity, and innovation, not only in poetry, but in jazz and all sorts of other capacities. We are happy to have him back here as a poet and a critic. He recently worked on an essay on Robert Frost. We are also honored to have a very special guest in the audience, Leslie Lee Francis, granddaughter of Robert Frost and author of Robert Frost, An Adventure in Poetry, 1900 to 1918. And Leslie, would you mind just standing so we can... Today's program will go as follows. In alphabetical order, our featured poets will read their favorite work by Robert Frost and talk about his influence on them. They will also read some of their own poems. Following the reading, Alice Burney, the wonderful Alice Burney of the library's manuscripts division, will come up to talk about this great tabletop display of Frost materials in our collection. And she'll talk about the invaluable work the division does to ensure that future generations can continue to learn about the exemplars of our culture. The manuscript division is one of the great resources at the library. If you want to find out more about the division, you can go to their website at www.loc.gov/rr/MSS. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our poets, Dana Gioia and Eric Pankey.
Good afternoon. It is a pleasure to be back in the greatest library in the world, especially on this happy occasion to celebrate one of the greatest poets in the long history of the English language. As chairman of the NEA and as a writer, I'm often interviewed, and reporters never really know what to ask a poet. And so they inevitably ask, well, who's your favorite American poet, or who's your favorite poet? After mumbling a few qualifications about this being a rather unfair question, I inevitably answer Robert Frost, both because I love his work, but also because he was supremely masterful in so many types of poetry. Of course, his greatness rests on the fact, that, in his own words, he, achieved the ambition of lodging a few poems in a place where they are difficult to get rid of. These truly unforgettable poems. But the amazing thing about Frost, the remarkable thing about Frost's greatness, was that he wrote so well in so many ways. He was equally skilled in comedy and tragedy. He wrote great lyric poems, great narrative poems, great didactic poems, and even some pretty great dramatic poems, depending on how you define that genre. He wrote great short poems. He wrote great longer poems. There is not another of his major 20th century American contemporaries who had this sort of supreme versatility. He also had the gift of writing poems that were equally powerful, equally persuasive to an average reader and to a scholar or a fellow writer. And I think he even had that hardest of gift, which was the ability to write tiny poems, almost epigrammatic poems of perfection that still seem fresh even if you've heard them 100 times. Nothing gold can stay. Nature's first green is gold, her hardest hue to hold. Her early leaf's the flower, but only so an hour. Then leaf subsides to leaf, so Eden sank to grief, so dawn goes down to day. Nothing gold can stay. I'm particularly, perhaps perversely happy to point out that Frost was a native Californian and a city boy. He was born in San Francisco, a densely populated city that virtually has no seasons. It's 65 degrees all year long. And he only came to New England when his father died. Until then, he probably had never seen snow or the changing of the seasons, or maybe even a birch tree. And he had, despite the family tragedy, the imaginative advantage of seeing the New England countryside with the freshness of an outsider, a sort of domestic immigrant. And with the kind of American immigrant energy, he made this landscape, this region, his own, reclaiming his father's New England birthright. I have read Frost so long, with such affection and attention. I have so many of his poems by heart that it's difficult for me to talk about what I've learned from him. But I think I can concisely speak about the impact he had on me at a particular point in my personal and artistic life, a turning point in my life in the summer of 1975. I was 24. I had dropped out of Harvard Graduate School. I realized that I wanted to be a poet, but I didn't want to be a professor. I decided to get a job unrelated to literature and to pursue poetry on the evenings and weekends as a private kind of calling. I was glad to know that Frost was a dropout too. who had slowly developed his craft in isolation from literary life during 20 solitary years, mostly while working as a farmer, living really in poverty, before publishing his first book at 39. The summer before I entered business, I spent each day at a table in the Inglewood Public Library. I love libraries. In Los Angeles, working on poetry and studying poems. The poet I studied most was Robert Frost. I was particularly interested in him because I wanted to write narrative poems, a literary mode that was then in total disrepute. Narrative poetry had been out of fashion then for at least a half century, but storytelling struck me then, as it does now, as an irreplaceable part of literature. The question was, how did you make it new? I didn't want to write epics, but rather mid-length poems, short stories, as it were, rather than novels. And so I went back to the greatest master of the mid-length verse narrative in American literature, Frost. And I studied some of his magnificent poems, Home Burial, The Witch of Coos, Death of a Hired Man, as well as some of his shorter poems. That experience changed the way I wrote. And here are, very briefly, some of the things I learned. First, Frost taught me the power of leaving something essential out of the poem. Frost's poems have such clarity and momentum that we don't always notice at first that they leave out something important. That absence, I believe, invites the reader to bring something from himself or herself to complete or clarify the poem. It invites, therefore, the reader to make the poem partially their own. Second, now, each of these points I could write an essay on, so you just got to bear with me. We got a mean timekeeper back here. Second, Frost's best poems have usually felt personal, but they never seemed overtly autobiographical. Now, this was 1975, and this realization was redemptive for me, because 1975 was the high point of confessional poetry, the age of tell-all verse, poems which almost always told us more than we needed or wanted to know about the poet. Frost had a different approach. His speakers, in this funny way, seemed half himself and half some representative figure which the reader could identify with. The poems weren't so specifically autobiographical that there wasn't room for the readers to project themselves into the poems. Now, to illustrate these first two points, the fact of leaving something essential out and creating a kind of figure that seemed personal but was also representative, let me share another poem which I'm sure you all know, Acquainted with the Night, which is a wonderful poem for an Italian because it's written in terza rima, even though it's a sonnet. I have been one acquainted with the night. I have walked out in rain and back in rain. I have outwalked the farthest city light. I have looked down the saddest city lane. I have passed by the watchman on his beat and dropped my eyes, unwilling to explain. I have stood still and stopped the sound of feet when far away an interrupted cry came over houses from another street, but not to call me back or say goodbye. And further still, at an earthly height, one luminary clock against the sky proclaimed the time was neither wrong nor right. I have been one acquainted with the night. Now, this poem never tells us the big question. Why is this fellow acquainted with the night? Why is he walking there? Why is he dropping his eyes in shame and in guilt? And why does Frost choose the meter that Dante invented to describe hell, to describe his life? But a crowd of sinners like us can provide our own motivations, can't we? Third, Frost's poems had attractive, sometimes even elegant surfaces, but hintings also of something troubled or uncontrollable below the surface. In other words, Frost's best poems offered a shining text and a shadowy subtext. This allows Frost to be simple on the surface of the poem, but complex in his ultimate effect. This was a liberating insight for me, because you realize that the surface of the poem is only the beginning of the poem, but it needs in itself to be irresistible. The magic of Frost's poems was to watch the text and subtext dance around each other. Frost is poetry's equivalent of Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers doing a great duet. The text caught and captivated the reader's attention. The subtext spoke to the reader's pre-rational intuition and imagination, not quite perhaps just to the subconscious, but to all the pre-rational elements in our intelligence. Noticing that change has affected almost every poem I've written since. Fourth, and finally, Frost's poems usually took the form of unresolved arguments. Frost loved to present two or more different points of view in his poems. The road not taken is two roads, and he almost never, at least in his great period, tells you that one perspective is better than another. I never take sides in my poems, he said. The poems don't conclude, they just end, with the central question usually hanging in the air. This was especially true of his narrative poems that are less conventional stories than dramatized debates, not of issues, but of human sensibilities. But it's also true of his short lyric poems. I'd love to read you, one of the longer poems, but this little poem will show it. I recently did a poll of what the favorite poem in the entire English language was for college students, and this, rather terrifyingly, was their choice: Fire and Ice. Some say the world will end in fire. Some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if it had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction ice is also great and would suffice. Even in this case, Frost does not pick a favorite between, hate and desire. And the most remarkable thing, this is the only poem I know that in 9 lines has the world in twice. There are other things I learned, such as how Frost kept his formal meters fresh by counterpointing them to American speech rhythms. But I'm short on time. And I want to make one more point about Frost's impact on me before I read a couple of my poems. For a young man embarking on a solitary and unorthodox path towards poetry, Frost not only taught me technical lessons, imaginative lessons, but he gave me what I needed most. Not simply the ways in which real poetry might be written, but his life, in its long and patient dedication, suggested that my quixotic journey towards the thankless muse might actually go somewhere worthwhile. Time has prevented me from reading any of Frost's narrative poems, and it likewise prevents me from reading any of my own narrative poems. So instead, I'll close by reading, or as Frost says, saying, 3 very short poems of my own. The first is called The Apple Orchard. And for those of you who know California, it takes place up in Sonoma County in the town of Sebastopol, which used to be full of apple orchards. Now it's mostly vineyards. The apple orchard. You won't remember it. The apple orchard we wandered through one April afternoon, climbing the hill behind the empty farm. A city boy, I'd never seen a grove burst in full flower or breathed the bitter, sweet perfume of blossoms mingled with the dust. A quarter mile of trees in fragrant rows, arching above us, we walked the aisle alone in spring's ephemeral cathedral. We had the luck, if you can call it that, of having been in love, but never lovers. The bright flame burning, fed by pure desire, nothing consumed. Such secrets brought to light. There was a moment when I stood behind you, reached out to spin you toward me, but I stopped. What more could I have wanted from that day? Everything, of course. Perhaps that was the point, to learn that what we will not grasp is lost. Two of the very short poems I chose by Frost, have that kind of epigrammatic quality. This is sort of a song-like quality in a lot of Frost's best poems. And this is a poem, it's the title poem of my new book, that's written with the transparency of a song. And in this case, it's a comic. It's a comic and not so comic poem. I wanted to use slang from my father's generation, from my generation, and from my son's generation. Pity the beautiful. Pity the beautiful. The dolls and the dishes, the babes with big daddies, granting their wishes. Pity the pretty boys, the hunks and Apollos, the golden lads whom success always follows, the hotties, the knockouts, the 10s out of 10, the drop-dead gorgeous, the great leading men. Pity the faded, the bloated, the blousy, the paunchy Adonis whose luck's turned lousy. Pity the gods, no longer divine. Pity the night, the stars lose their shine. And I'll close with a short poem. The central tragedy of Frost's life, and it was an ongoing tragedy, was the loss of his children at birth, in childhood, in adulthood. My wife and I lost our first son, and there's something that happens, there's many things that happen, but there's something odd that happens when you lose a child, is for the rest of the time, he has a kind of phantom childhood. You see a kid that would be about his age and this, that, or the other, and you begin to sort of see what he might have been through other children. I wrote this poem in Washington, D.C. On his 21st birthday. It's called Majority. Now you'd be 3, I said to myself, seeing a child born the same summer as you. Now you'd be 6 or 7 or 10. I watched you grow in foreign bodies, laughing, jumping into a pool, all laughter, or frowning over a keyboard, but mostly just standing, taller each time. How splendid your most mundane activity seemed in these joyful proxies. I often held back tears. Now you are 21. Finally, it makes sense that you have moved away into your own afterlife. Thank you so much.
That's a tough act to follow. Wonderful. Poetry, Frost argues, begins in reading books. And the poet writes out of the eddy of his mind of all the books he has ever read. The whole thing is performance and prowess and feats of association. Anyone reading my first two books published in the 1980s would see the connection to Frost. But in all honesty, and here is the blasphemy, I had read very little Frost at that time, except for the anthology pieces. If I knew Frost, I knew him secondhand by way of the influence he had had on poets I found myself reading in the late 70s and the early 1980s. Seamus Heaney, Philip Levine, Elizabeth Bishop, James Wright, just to name a few. Nonetheless, the public relations people at Athenaeum drafted jacket copy for my second book, Heartwood, that read, very much to my surprise, Eric Pankey is a poet of weather and seasons, and he deals with them with an easy authority not unlike a young Robert Frost. We won't trouble here just what the blurb ease means here. Easy authority, not unlike. But the comparison demanded that I dig deep into Frost's work, become intimate with what I'd only known as a kind of hand-me-down influence. Much of the teaching I've done over the last quarter century has focused on the nature of, the habit of, and the possibilities of the lyric poem in the 20th and 21st century. I've written elsewhere about the tendency of the lyric poem and its singular purpose, its efficiency, its rush towards closure, its close and enclosing orbit around the moment of a thing perceived, a thing felt, a thing understood, if only momentarily. And I've written as well about a lyric subgenre, the meditation or the meditative poem, of which Frost is a master, where the poet stays in the lyric moment by continually turning away from the conventions of closure by way of reflection, refraction, concentration, continuation, and involution, by troubling the logic of the narrative, the terms of an argument, by digressing, by spiraling around, or by pearling the grit at the heart of the lyric moment. Today, I'd like to think about a kind of meditative form that is as well a meditative subject, and that subject is the walk. Many of my favorite poets and favorite poems are often going out on walks. My two earliest favorites were William Wordsworth's Lines Composed a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey and Wallace Stevens's Idea of Order at Key West. In these two poems, we find out late in the game that our walkers are not solitary, but have in fact been accompanied on their walks. Wordsworth by his sister Dorothy, and Stevens by one Ramon Fernandez. Well, I began to look for poems, the shape of which and the subject of which were walks, and in particular, solitary walks, like Gary Snyder's A Walk, or A.R. Ammons's Corson's Inlet, which concludes beautifully that there is no finality of vision, that I have perceived nothing completely, that tomorrow a new walk is a new walk. Let me be clear, a walk, the sort of walk I'm talking about, is not a hike. A walk is not a trip, not a planned journey. Frost has said calculation is usually no part of the first step of any walk. It begins without a destination in mind and unfolds, unravels before you. The walk, like the poem, is not seeking, as Ammon suggests, finality or completion, but an attentiveness and perhaps even a distractedness within the moment of moving and perceiving. So here's a poem by Robert Frost. It will be familiar to most of you, but I read it without its title so that when we come to the titular object in the poem, it will be as if we were the walkers and have just now stumbled upon the object. And I wish I had this by heart, as Dana was doing so beautifully. Out walking on the frozen swamp one gray day, I paused and said, I will turn back from here. No, I will go on further, and we shall see. The hard snow held me, save where now and then one foot went through. The view was all in lines, straight up and down, of tall, slim trees, too much alike to mark or name a place by, so as to say for certain I was here or somewhere else. I was just far from home. A small bird flew before me. He was careful to put a tree between us when he lighted, and to say no word to tell me who he was who was foolish enough as to think what he thought. He thought that I was after him for a feather, the white one on his tail, like one who takes everything said as personal to himself. One flight out sideways would have undeceived him. And then there was a pile of wood for which I forgot him and let his little fear carry him off the way I might have gone, without so much as wishing him good night. He went behind it to make his last stand. It was a cord of maple, cut and split and piled, and measured 4 by 4 by 8. And not another like it could I see. No runner tracks, and this year's snow looped next it. And it was older, sure, than this year's cutting, or even last year's or the years before. The wood was gray, and the bark warping off it, and the pile somewhat sunken. Clematis had wound strings round and round it, like a bundle. What held it, though, on one side was a tree still growing, and on one, a stake and prop, the latter about to fall. I thought someone who lived in turning to fresh tasks could so forget his handiwork on which he spent himself, the labor of his axe, and leave it there, far from a useful fireplace, to warm the frozen swamp as best it could, with a slow, smokeless burning of decay. Well, the speaker of our poem is on a walk, a common enough journey, and one without a premeditated destination. In fact, he walks where in 3 other seasons he might not, in a swamp, which is by its nature unwelcoming, soft underfoot, boggy, buggy, pathless, all rank and welter. Now winter, the slime and muck of frozen swamp can hold him up, and thus he can venture in. Yet only a line into the poem, our speaker gives up on entering inward. He pauses, stating first, I will turn back from here. And having interrupted his journey, he changes his mind about changing his course and says, no, I will go on further, and we shall see. That first person plural invites us along for the walk, and we wonder, what exactly is it we shall see? We shall see. Is that even a statement about the sights ahead, or is it an omission of uncertainty that we might translate as who knows? The walk thus far, merely 3 lines into the poem, is one of hesitations, qualifications, stops and starts. It continues in such a fashion. Things are stable, then they are not. The hard snow held me up, save where now and then one foot went through. The particulars of the place do not distinguish it, but in fact make it indistinguishable. The view was all in lines straight up and down of tall, slim trees, too much alike to mark or name a place by, so as to say for certain I was here or somewhere else. All the speaker can say for sure is that he is far from home, where one assumes the snow and ice holds one up, where the trees are distinct enough to be landmarks so that one knows where one is. Is he lost? Or does he just not know where he is? Are these the same thing or different experiences? Why should we care to follow such a hapless guide into such unpromising territory? Then the bird appears, and the description of the bird seems in many ways to mirror our speaker. This is almost an act of self-portraiture. Our speaker, who seems to take everything he experiences as personal to himself. The snow will not hold him up, the trees will not guide his way. The bird, did he expect it to? Will say no word to him. How much ground has been covered during this little delirious reverie about the bird? If a walk is taken without a thought of an end point, then our speaker's digressions about the bird is not unlike his other stops and starts so far in the poem. The subject of the poem has been and continues to be what comes into view next. If our speaker is uncertain of his location, the bird perhaps has taken on the role of a guide or a scout, or perhaps the bird has led him astray. The speaker continues, and then there was a pile of wood for which I forgot him. And let his little fear carry him off the way I might have gone. The way I might have gone confirms that the walker's intent was to keep walking. But the double conjunction of "and then" announces we have arrived at the effect of all the previous causes, hesitations, and detours thus far in the poem. It was a cord of maple, cut and split and piled, and measured 4 by 4 by 8. Notice things are really now distinguishable. No runner tracks in this year's snow looped near it. And it was older sure than this year's cutting, or even last year's or the years before. The wood was gray and the bark warping off it, and the pile somewhat sunken. Clematis had wound strings round and round it like a bundle. What held it, though, on one side was a tree still growing, and on one a stake and a prop, the latter about to fall. The wood pile, and that is, of course, the poem's title, stands in the midst of a swamp, cut, split, stacked, built by another's hand, another who had ventured, as our speaker, into this unwelcoming and impractical place. The wood pile upon which much labor has been spent to gather and arrange is left to the will of entropy. It has begun to sink into the soft earth of the swamp. The clematis has wrapped and bundled it, and would, in another season, have camouflaged it. Our speaker might not even have noticed it in full summer. The handiwork that shored up the pile is about to give way to ruin. And as he turns his thoughts to an absent other, this maker of a seemingly useless thing, one senses the speaker continues his act of self-portraiture. Is not the making of a poem a similar labor on which one spends oneself, imagining while writing that the labor is practical, that the poem might be of some use? But in the end, the finished poem is left behind as the poet pursues new tasks, new poems. The poem is left behind for others to stumble upon. I thought that only someone who lived in turning to fresh tasks could so forget his handiwork on which he had spent himself, the labor of his axe, and leave it there, far from a useful fireplace, to warm the frozen swamp as best it could, with the slow, smokeless burning of decay. The last 2 lines of this poem have been much discussed elsewhere and are, to my mind, flawless. So I would like to let them sit there and sort of be beyond paraphrase. But they're the kinds of lines that makes one want to be a poet. You read that, to warm the frozen swamp as best it could with the slow, smokeless burning of decay, and I think, yes, yes. Well, what I thought I would do is read you a poem from my very first book that is a walk, an accompanied walk called A Walk with My Father, and then a poem from my most recent book called A Line Made from Walking, which is actually several walks that are remembered as a single walk. What's it?
Titles again.
I will give them to you. Just a second. Yeah, that's fine. A Walk with My Father. A columbine's clear violet afternoon rain, the ditch of a creek we'd followed here, muddy water stippled with shadow. It is 1966. On the bank, a carp, or what was left of one, covered with a glow of flies. Green gold, a momentary body of light, lifted as he turned the fish over with a stick. The exposed flesh was flat, white, raw as a wound, unearthly, or too much of the earth. The dull texture of clay, the dust white of lime. To satisfy me, he pushed it over the grassy bank. The heat was visible on the rank air, rising against a drift of daisies. I followed the fish downstream until it caught on rocks, pale jutted limestone, and the slow water worked its gills, opening, open, as if that would help. And this is a brand new book, and I have to admit, this is the first time I've ever read this poem out loud in public. So forgive me already. A line made by walking. Below a ravine green with fern, and deeper still, a moss-edged sinkhole. Nothing, it seems, but a crescent moon all April, a mute yoke with which to bear a burden. Strewn across the high valley, stone flakes, arrowheads, the remains of ancient fires. I long for nothingness, but my flawed heart cannot keep up. Above a terrace of fog traces, water pools before the falls, then falls. What day is not a feast day? I close my eyes and the image persists, the glint of an unnamed hour, the path groomed by use. Later I'll look up and see a sky executed in silver leaf, stars like a summer's catch afloat on a stringer, or it's overcast, clouds like laden galleons moving like the past off to the left as I read toward the now. The mockingbird, fluent in every tongue but its own, tries out the song plankton makes as it filters sunlight. Everything, Paul Éluard says, can be compared to everything. Everything finds its echo, its reason, its resemblance, its contrast, its becoming everywhere. The storm still far off, yet 2 or 3 drops fall like dabs of sealing wax upon a table. Clouds pile up, then part. From the pines, dew drips. Behind smoke haze, the worn-down Blue Ridge. If the world is but a veil, why this cold at my bones, this fever in which I am swaddled? I am not myself tonight, I say, meaning that is all I am. One of the trucks hauling the town's dismantled carnival runs over a skunk. I catch on the wind a whiff of my own past, an acrid, wiry thread of distance. How obvious it seems now. Without expectation, one feels less disappointment. As always, the future is just ahead, a badly tuned car idling on a gravel shoulder. After the storm, chainsaws harass the afternoon, bees weigh down the lavender. Take heart, I console myself. Days arrive, one at a time, more than a little unkempt. Is that the wind in the grass, or the shimmer of a startled snake? If I could graft a curve or chart the meander, or pinpoint the instance of dissolution, I might transcribe the severe elegance of the sun just up. The day moon is jade, vitreous dream larva. A hawk circles the fallow lands. Barbed wire darkens with rust. The rest of the day waits beyond the rutted path like an almshouse. The dog finds a fox skull in a fern brake, paws at it, picks up deer scent, nose down, moves on. I follow the leash taut, go where I'm pulled. Autumn dusk, creek after rain, silt heavy, swollen, rapids over submerged rocks. Deer tracks end at a thicket, but the dog continues to tug. Let's head home, I say. The leash goes slack and he follows me. Memory, like a black hole, distorts time. Snow on the windfall, cusp of ice where a hoof sank in mud. If all matter is constant, what can one add to creation? Not bitter but thaw cold, except when the wind blows. As I walk, I live inside my thoughts, a dwelling all cellar and attic. If I track what leaves no trace, why does each outing circle back home? Uphill, a fox bark. Smoke hangs slack above chimneys. Late winter sun on fallen pine needles. A walk is never the theory of a walk, or rather, never merely. The worked edge of the evening sky is what I found as I looked for a place to hide. It wouldn't be a long story if it could be made short. Thank you.
The Library of Congress now holds approximately 70 million items in its manuscript division. The collections feature the papers of 23 early presidents and pioneers in many fields. The Wright brothers, Alexander Graham Bell, Sigmund Freud, Ambassador Averell Harriman, abolitionist Frederick Douglass, Margaret Mead, Margaret Sanger, Justices Earl Warren, and Thurgood Marshall, for example. There are also over 2,000 literary collections and theatrical collections. We have the major Walt Whitman collections and the papers of Edna St. Vincent Millay, Bernard Malamud, Ralph Ellison, and Philip Roth, to name a few. In this context, my predecessors collected 3 groups of papers of Robert Frost: the Untermeyer Frost Collection, a Robert Frost miscellany, and a small donation from Stuart Udall. The considerable material on Frost in the Library of Congress archives remains untapped for today's presentation. Louis Untermeyer, editor, poet, anthologist, donated his Frost collection in 1962 with some later additions. The collection spans the period 1913 to 1964 and is comprised of some 500 items housed in 12 containers like this one. It consists of letters from Frost to Untermeyer, who died in 1977, dealing with poets and poetry, religion, philosophy, politics, and other interests of the two men. Also included are articles, pamphlets, inscribed first editions of Frost's poetry, and signed photographs. Their correspondence was published in 1963. The over 250 friendly letters begin in 1915, and many are handwritten by Frost. The last, Mrs. Untermeyer, described them as expressing, quote, numerous nuances of a singular and affectionate regard, admiration, exasperation, concern, dependency, delight, possessiveness, gratitude, enjoyment, criticism, anger, security, and trust. Both Frost and Untermeyer were good friends of the Library of Congress, Frost having proudly served as consultant in poetry 1958 to 59, and honorary consultant to the humanities 58 through 63. The library mounted an exhibition of Frostiana in 1955-56 and held a press conference for his November 1962 visit. He recorded readings of his poetry many times for the archives of recorded poetry and literature. Untermeyer became consultant in poetry in 1961-63 after Eberhardt followed Frost. Sheila McMullen and I have selected a group of representative items from this collection to show you. On the table are fair copies of some famous poems, which Frost liked to make, the fair copies, a photograph of a very young Frost, sample letters to Untermeyer, and some beautiful first editions, which the donor required to be kept together with the papers. Usually they would be sent to the rare book division. Some letters were glued into the books, and many are intimately connected with the various special printings of Frost's work. One reprint, Frost notes to Untermeyer, is made on paper made in Spain in 1790. The paper and the printings are exquisite. On display are a facsimile of Frost's first poem, 1892, which was part of his high school valedictory. First editions of A Boy's Will, his first book, and of The Road Not Taken, just a few from the many, and miniature handmade Christmas greeting books sent by Frost, 1934 to 39. Our second group at the end of the table, our Frost material, came to us from various donors, including Gertrude Whittall, who endowed the room we're in today, a great friend and patron of poetry. Shown are the handwritten poem Away, which Mrs. Whittall donated, and a photograph of a very young, handsome Frost. The final item on the easel was donated by Stuart Udall in 1969. It's Dedication by Frost, the poem, typescript with his own holograph script corrections in ink, and on the last page, which you can't see there, is Stuart Udall's holograph printed clarifications in pencil. That's specially mounted for our core collection of treasures. This is the reading text Frost composed for delivery at the inauguration of President Kennedy, January 20th, 1961, but did not read because of the glare of sun upon snow. Some of you may remember it. Instead, the poet put the manuscript aside and recited from memory, or said, the gift outright, which everybody knows. Dedication appears under the title For John Kennedy, His Inauguration, in the 1969 edition of Poetry of Robert Frost. This first version of the poem was donated by Udall. He explained that no one had expected Frost to write a new poem for the inauguration, as he had steadfastly refused to compose commemorative verse during his entire lifetime. On the morning of the ceremony, Udall heard Frost reading aloud in his bedroom. He emerged, handed Udall the dedication manuscript, and pleased with this surprise, said, "I've been practicing up." Udall had a clean typescript prepared, and Frost took both versions to the ceremony. Near the end of the day, Udall asked Frost for the original manuscript of the unread new poem. Frost agreed and added the inscription, which appears above the title, for Stuart from Robert on the day, January 20th, 1961. You'll be able to look at these materials.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.